Welcome back to Holy Nerdvana, where we seek gaming zen. Today, we're here with 7 Days to Die. It first released to early access in 2013, with a PlayStation 4 and Xbox One version in 2016. And now, just this past July, it reached the official version 1.0 milestone. After all that time, I thought that with lots of people playing the game, it would be lovely to have some up-to-date benchmarks. We've got the RTX 4060 and RX 7600 XT running here, offering relatively similar performance. The 4060 ends up being just a hair faster overall, but nothing too striking. Stepping up to the RX 7900 GRE and the RTX 4070, both mainstream GPUs, the 7900 GRE definitely outperforms the 4070. This is at 1080p and medium settings, so it's not really where the cards are intended to run games, especially lighter games. We won't see that same level of performance difference as we go up the settings and resolution ladder, but it is what it is, as they say. Here are the RX 7900 XTX and the RTX 4080 Super, and AMD again has a modest lead, averaging close to 270 frames per second compared to about 250 frames per second on the 4080 Super. So very, very playable. Of course, some of this depends on the scene within the game, but what you see in our benchmark sequence is pretty representative of what you'll encounter as you run around the game world. And wrapping up our 1080p medium testing, we have the RTX 4090 with the RX 7900 XTX. And similar to what we saw with the 4080 Super, the 4090 gets around 250 frames per second. That clearly indicates we're hitting CPU bottlenecks that are limiting performance for Nvidia's cards to about 250, while AMD's cards seem to have a little bit of a higher threshold for maximum performance. That doesn't show up in the real-time frame rates you can see in green here, but we're capturing gameplay and that's likely inducing a bit more GPU load. Here's the performance when we're not capturing gameplay, and you can see AMD has 270 and 260 FPS on the 7900 cards. Minimums, however, are quite a bit lower. That's probably because 7 Days to Die uses the Unity engine, which isn't known for being a high-performance engine. It doesn't look very modern either, not for 2024, so even though the game just got its 1.0 release, it's a bit of a throwback in terms of system requirements. But everything is obviously playable at 1080p medium, so let's move on to 1080p Ultra, maxed out settings, still without upscaling. The game does support FSR upscaling, and apparently it's even FSR 3, though FrameGen isn't present, so we're not quite sure what happened there. Anyway, we didn't think it was necessary to test upscaling because performance in general is already high enough, and the game just doesn't look that amazing. Still, if you want higher frame rates on a lesser GPU, FSR 3 can help out. It's a bit like running at a lower resolution, with a debatable potential improvement for image quality. Okay, back to the testing. We're at 1080p Ultra now, starting with the RTX 4060 and RX 7600 XT. The extra VRAM isn't helping the AMD card, as it's still getting slightly lower performance but with substantially worse minimum frames per second. With the RX 7900 GRE and RTX 4070, the two GPUs are relatively close. The AMD card is faster, by maybe 15% or so, but again with minimum frames per second, that's 1% L line in the corner, the second line, you'll see the AMD cards often drop quite a bit lower than on the Nvidia cards. That's probably just drivers and optimizations, but this is an older game and I don't think any of the GPU companies are really going out and doing a ton of optimization for it these days. Our high-end cards, the RX 7900 XTX and RTX 4080 Super, perform pretty comparably here. Nvidia has taken a slight lead, with just over 200 frames per second versus just under 200 frames per second on the XTX, but we're still pretty much hitting CPU limits on both GPUs. And here's the RTX 4090 with the 7900 XTX. As before, Nvidia has a slight performance advantage, but the average FPS sits at 205 compared to 197, so it's nothing you'd actually notice. The 1% lows are also basically tied at around 125, with a pretty big gap between average FPS and 1% lows that indicates there's probably some micro stutter happening. That's common with games that aren't tuned as nicely, which for a game that's been around 10 years since its early access days you would hope maybe more tuning would take place. Looking at the chart, the top 3 GPUs all hit roughly the same level of performance. Again, that's a good indication it's hitting CPU bottlenecks, though we should see less of that at higher resolutions. And the rankings of the cards basically make sense. GPUs that are normally faster in other games place higher here as well, and the slower GPUs are further down the chart. We're halfway through, now testing at 1440p Ultra. The RTX 4060 and RX 7600 XT are beginning to struggle, with neither one managing 60 FPS. The Nvidia card does quite a bit better on the 1% lows, getting around 40 compared to just 25 on the AMD card, even though their average FPS is almost the same at 48 to 50 frames per second. Kicking up to the RX 7900 GRE and the RTX 4070, the 4070 still falls behind in average performance by 10 to 15%, but the GRE has worse 1% lows. That's a bit of an odd duck, because the AMD GPU has more VRAM and we wouldn't normally expect to see worse minimums, but this is just the way game engines and optimizations sometimes work. We don't see those poor 1% lows as much on the 7900 XTX, which is kind of interesting. Does that mean it's memory bandwidth related, or something else? We're not sure, but what can you do about it? As for the RX 7900 XTX and RTX 4080 Super, they're again pretty close in performance, but the 4080 Super in this case has about a 3 to 4% average FPS lead, with 1% lows that are around 20% higher. That's not good, though it's still better than we saw with the 7900 GRE. That applies to the RTX 4090 and the XTX as well. We're getting nearly 200 frames per second on the 4090, 193 you'll see in the chart in a moment, compared to 146 on the XTX and 153 on the 4080 Super. In general, then, we're no longer hitting massive CPU bottlenecks at 1440p Ultra. There might be a little bit of a CPU bottleneck on the 4090 still, because that 200 FPS is pretty close to what we got at 1080p as well, but the 4080 Super and below look to be fully GPU constrained. Here's the overall chart then, with pretty familiar rankings. The 4090 is the fastest GPU around, and 4080 Super comes in second, just barely ahead of the 7900 XTX. RX 7900 GRE tends to outperform the 4070, at least in rasterization games like this, and we measured 100 FPS versus 84 FPS, except minimums are better on the 4070. And the 4060 and 7600 XT are pretty close to tied as well, but with rather poor 1% lows on the 7600 XT. Wrapping up our testing of 7 days to die, we have the 4K Ultra results, starting at the bottom of the stack with the RTX 4060 and RX 7600 XT. And these cards are definitely struggling with 4K native rendering, so the FSR3 upscaling would definitely help, and you'd probably want to run high or medium upscaling to really boost performance. But 4K native really isn't the intended target for these cards, even in less demanding games from nearly a decade back. 20 to 25 frames per second is not great. The RTX 4070 and RX 7900 GRE basically double the performance of the budget cards, hitting playable frame rates, but the 1% lows on the GRE fall into the low 20s and that's quite poor. Upscaling would improve the general feel of the game, but the 4070 and Nvidia's drivers seem to be doing better with Unity Engine in 7 days to die. It's kind of the reverse of what we saw with Once Human, which was using DirectX 11 as well, where the 4080 Super was a bit slower than the 7900 XTX. Now the 4080 Super is a little bit faster with better minimums as well. So which GPU is better very much depends on the game in question. And at the top, we have the RTX 4090 averaging just over 90 frames per second, almost 40% faster than the 4080 Super and 43% faster than the 7900 XTX. That's a pretty big gap, and it's what we typically see when games are fully GPU limited. There's just nothing that can touch the RTX 4090. Obviously, that's a GPU that costs about twice as much as the 4080 Super and 7900 XTX, but if you're already willing to spend $1,000 or £1,000 for my fellow compatriots, going up to the 4090 could make sense. Or at least, it would have made sense 2 years ago. Now, you should just wait for the RTX 5090, which should arrive in January. It will probably cost $2,000, maybe even $2,500, but if you want the fastest GPU for the next 2 years, that's almost certainly going to be it. And here's the overall chart for 4K Ultra. Again, look at those low minimum FPS on the AMD cards, except for the 7600 XT, which appears to be so bottlenecked by the GPU that there's no room for stuttering, and the same thing happens on the 4060. But the GRE and the XTX have pretty severe 1% low drops compared to their average FPS. And that's a wrap on 7 Days to Die. It's an oldie but goldie. Lots of people continue to play it, peaking at over 60,000 in the past month on Steam. We hope you've enjoyed this video. If so, please like, share, subscribe, and let us know in the comments what other games you'd like to see benchmarked. Cheers for tuning in, love. If you see me in the pub, don't be shy, I'm always fond of a pale ale. Don't be a stranger. Bye for now.